Okay, we interrupt this Aleinu for a word from our sponsors. So I was in the chapel when we normally do a sermon here, so I missed, but we'll do a little bit now. But we're still early, so, we have some time before lunch. I'm going to tell a story now that we often tell, we conservative rabbis love to tell many, many times, so you've probably heard it several times already. Hopefully it won't be too painful to hear it again. But I promise you this time I'm going to give you the end of the story, which we often don't tell, and then the reason why it's told in the Talmud, which is different than the reason we usually use for it. Okay, is everybody ready? So this is the story of Rabbi Eliezer and the rest of the sages. We've heard this story a few times. Rabbi Eliezer believed that a particular kind of oven made out of clay parts could be made kosher again. Everybody else on the Sanhedrin, the Supreme Court in Jewish tradition, ruled against him. And he argued and argued and argued, gave all these logical reasons for why he was right. None of the arguments persuaded his colleagues. They continued to vote against him. After giving up on logic, he decided to give supernatural proofs that he was correct. So the first thing he said was, if I'm right, this carob tree that you see standing outside our study house will prove it for you. And sure enough, this carob tree uprooted itself and flew off 100 amot. An amma, as I think I've said a few times, is from the tip of your finger to your elbow. Depends on how big that is, how big you are, as to how many inches that is. Generally speaking, 18 inches, a foot and a half. 100 amot would therefore be 150 feet, or approximately 50 yards, which is half a football field, right? Some people said it flew off 400 amot, in which case it's 600 feet, 200 yards, or 2 football fields, right? That's quite a distance. This tree flew quite a distance out into space and landed on the ground. The rabbis were not impressed. They said, Rabbi Yeshua in particular jumps up and says, we don't take evidence from carob trees. This is a court of law. I'm not impressed. So then Rabbi Eliezer said, fine, if I am right, the stream that's flowing right beside our house of study will prove it to you. And sure enough, the stream defied the laws of gravity and started to flow uphill. And the same Rabbi Yeshua jumped up and said, this is a court of law. We do not take evidence from streams of water. So then Rabbi Eliezer, exasperated, said, fine, if I'm right, the walls of this house of study will prove it. And sure enough, the walls started to shake and rattle and to collapse in on top of the sages while they're discussing, threatening their very lives. And again, Rabbi Yeshua jumps up and he yells at the walls, when scholars are discussing a matter of Jewish law, what business is it of yours? You stay out of it. And in deference to Rabbi Eliezer, the walls did not straighten, but in deference to Rabbi Yeshua, they didn't collapse in on top of everybody. And they stayed crooked, it says, from then on. That's why the walls of the study house were crooked from then on. Finally, Rabbi Eliezer pulls out his trump card and he says, if I am right, God himself will prove it. And sure enough, a bat kol, a voice from heaven, calls out, why are you disputing with Rabbi Eliezer? Don't you know that in matters of Jewish law, Rabbi Eliezer is always right? Now, at this point, you need to know a little about Rabbi Eliezer. In another place in the Talmud, Rabbi Eliezer is described as having a mind that's like a plastered cistern. So that's an ancient way of saying he had a photographic memory. He didn't forget a drop of what he learned. He remembered exactly and precisely what his teachers told him. And so, in fact, what he was telling the people, his colleagues was, this is exactly what my teacher told me, which is exactly what his teacher told him, which is exactly what his teacher told him, going all the way back to Moses at Mount Sinai. I am telling you what the law is, and I know it for a fact because I have a perfect memory. And the sages were saying, we don't care. We're interpreting the law for our generation, and this is what we say is the law. So anyway, that's why this voice from heaven says Rabbi Eliezer is always right. And once again, Rabbi Yeshua jumps up and yells back at God, Lo bashamayim he, quoting one of God's own words from the book of Deuteronomy, saying the Torah is not in heaven. He said to God, as it were, you gave us the Torah. You told us to follow a majority of the sages when we have a question of Jewish law. We have voted. This is what we decided. And it's sort of like when your kids grow up and they leave home and you're not happy with what they're doing. And they say to you, you know what? I'm living my own life now. I'm an adult. I have to make my own decisions. That's kind of what he's saying to God. He said, look, you gave us the law. We appreciate very much all this wisdom, but we now need to apply your teachings to the real world that we live in, and this is how we believe it needs to be. And so he said to God, as it were, you stay out of it. Now, the story goes on to say that there's this idea in rabbinic lore that the prophet Elijah didn't die, because in the Bible it doesn't say he actually died. It said he went up to heaven. And so the tradition was that he sort of travels between heaven and earth. And if you know how to spot him, you can find him in the marketplace somewhere. And there was a rabbi who was good at this. He could spot Rabbi Elijah if he happened to be hanging around. And he ran into Elijah one day, says the Talmud, and he asked Elijah the prophet, what did God say when Rabbi Yeshua jumped up and told him to mind his own business? And the prophet Elijah said, God laughed, and said, my children have defeated me. Sort of admitting as a parent, well, I guess they're on their own, they're independent, they make up their own minds, and I approve, as it were. But that's not where the story ends. Now, usually we tell this story to tell you the authority of rabbinic power, right? The importance of having rabbis who are living in the real world interpret the law in ways that make sense for the community and age they're living in. And that's an important teaching, but that's not the reason it's brought in the Talmud. And the rest of the story ends up telling you what the reason it's brought in the Talmud for, and it relates to the Torah portion, as I'll explain. So what happens next? They've now disagreed with Rabbi Eliezer. He refuses to give in. At this point, he is considered a rebellious sage, and he is supposed to be excommunicated because he continues to want to teach his tradition as being the truth when he's been overruled. So he is excommunicated. It's kind of like being removed from the bench. But then they have to figure out who's going to tell him. So Rabbi Akiva, his favorite student, says, I'll tell him. And he goes to visit him, and he sits at a distance somewhat away from Rabbi Eliezer, showing that he's distancing himself, which is what you're supposed to do when you're excommunicated. He sits low on the ground. He's wearing black clothes, which are mourner's garments, which is what an excommunicated person is supposed to do. And so before he even opens his mouth, he's kind of already signaling to Rabbi Eliezer what has happened. Rabbi Eliezer says, what happened? And Rabbi Akiva says, well, it seems your colleagues have distanced themselves from you. So again, a very polite way to say this. So Rabbi Eliezer realizes what happened. He puts on mourner's clothes, and he sits low on the ground like a mourner, and he feels very bad. But that's not the end of the story. Out of deference to Rabbi Eliezer, nature rebels against the sages, and 1/3 of all the produce disappears because they ruled against Rabbi Eliezer and they humiliated him. So 1/3 of all the produce is gone. They have 1/3 less crops and everything in the land. Moreover, the rabbis kind of imagined that they had superpowers, and like Superman, anywhere he would gaze, he would burn something to a crisp. He had Superman's laser vision. So he would look somewhere and it would burn something to the crisp. And it was very bad. And then Rabban Gamliel, who was the head of the Sanhedrin, head of the Supreme Court, and therefore responsible for this decision, was on a ship. And while the ship was out at sea, a storm came up and threatened to destroy the ship because of Rabbi Eliezer. When Rabban Gamliel yelled back at God, he said, hey, you know that I only did this for your glory, because I didn't want the Jewish people to become divided, to become separated, to be antagonistic towards each other. We needed to have a unified tradition here. I only did it for your sake. And the storm subsided. That's not the end of the story. Then it turns out that Rabbi Eliezer was married to a woman the Talmud calls Ima Shalom, which means mother of peace. She was called mother of peace because not only was she Rabbi Eliezer's wife, she was the sister of Rabbi Gamliel. So she is sort of a bridge between these two factions. And she would watch her husband, Rabbi Eliezer, like a hawk every time he prayed in the morning. During the weekday, there's a certain part of the prayer called Tachanun, where you fall on your face and you pray for God's forgiveness and you admit your sins and you feel remorse. She was afraid that if her husband ever did Tachanun and prayed for remorse from God, God would have mercy on him and would kill her brother. So she prevented her brother, her husband, from praying Tachanun every single day. Until one day, when she thought it was Rosh Chodesh, the new month. And the new month, you don't pray Tachanun. So she wasn't worried. But Rabban Gamliel said, it is not Rosh Chodesh. So he did Tachanun while she wasn't looking. She saw him doing Tachanun and she cried out, "You have killed my brother." And sure enough, a voice called out from the city, Rabban Gamliel has died. That's the end of the story. What is the purpose that they brought this story for? Not to teach what we like to teach, which is important, that rabbis have the authority to interpret the law for their age, but the importance of not humiliating somebody. They humiliated Rabbi Eliezer, and it had dire consequences, even though he was wrong. And so this is something that's important. Our sages said it is important for us to have vigorous debate. We are passionate about our viewpoints and our perspectives. In the country we live in today, unfortunately, we have a lot of very serious issues that we're very passionate about, and we have different perspectives, whether it's abortion, whether it's about the environment, whether it's about immigration, taxes, balancing the budget, whatever it is. We all are very passionate about our perspectives. And if we are arguing for the sake of heaven, that is, we truly believe that this is what God would want us to do, we're allowed to be passionate. But we can't humiliate each other, and we can't be divisive, because that is not what God wants us to do. So we need to argue passionately, but politely, and with a great deal of humility, like Rabbi Akiva when he went to tell his teacher that he was put in cherem. And this was an important teaching that the Talmud brought, and they based it on the verse from the Torah portion this morning, Lo tonu, do not oppress your friend, your neighbor. Do not oppress your neighbor. And there it talks mostly about oppressing with words or in contracts, by not charging too much for land, not oppressing somebody with wages or whatever. But it also says don't oppress them with words, because words can be just as powerful, just as painful, and just as dangerous as contractual matters. And that's the teaching from this week's Talmud portion, Torah portion, and from the Talmud on it. Shabbat Shalom.